Hello and welcome to a virtual panel discussion on equity, inclusion, and immigration in the Nordic countries. I'm Sally Yurkovich, Director of Educational Exchange and Special Projects at the American Scandinavian Foundation, and I'm pleased to moderate this panel today. I'm joined by four distinguished guests. The first, Jason Timbuktu Diakité, is one of Sweden's most well-known hip-hop artists. Born in Lund to American parents, an African-American dad and a white mom, he has released 8 solo albums and numerous singles, the majority of which have reached gold or platinum status. His accolades include 8 Swedish Grammy Awards and 4 Swedish Radio Awards. He has performed all over the world, from Africa to Svalbard, from the Apollo in New York City to the Roxy in Los Angeles, and at the Polar Music Prize and the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremonies. Jason is the author of the critically acclaimed memoir, A Drop of Midnight, which has sold more than 100,000 copies in Sweden and was adapted by the author into a stage performance in 2017. We're looking forward to the premiere of that stage performance in New York at Harlem Stage in the spring of 2021. Jonas Hassen Khemiri is the author of 5 novels, 6 plays, and a collection of essays, plays, and short stories. Among his many honors are the August Prize, the highest literary award for Swedish literature, the Enquist Prize, the Boris Tidning Award for Best Literary Debut Novel, and an Obie Award. His novels have been translated into more than 30 languages, and his 6 plays have been performed by more than 100 companies around the world. He lives in Stockholm, and his latest book, The Family Clause, was published just last month. You'll find on the Scandinavia House website an interview with Jonas that was done just last month about the preview of his book. Simon Pasternak is a publisher of Danish and translated fiction at Denmark's largest publishing house, Gyldendal Publishers. He's published works by Yahya Hassan, Christian Jungersson, Naya Marie Oates, and Kim Lena, among others. Simon Pasternak has himself written 6 novels. Death Zones was published in 2016, and he's also written TV series and features. And finally, our 4th panelist is Marcus Samuelsson, an acclaimed chef behind many restaurants worldwide, including Red Rooster Harlem, Marcus Montreal, and Marcus B&P in Newark, New Jersey. Samuelsson was the youngest person to ever receive a 3-star review from the New York Times and has won multiple James Beard Foundation Awards, including Best Chef, New York City, and Outstanding Personality for No Passport Required on PBS. He is the author of multiple books, including the New York Times bestselling memoir, Yes, Chef, and his latest book, The Rise, Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food, will debut on October 27th. His podcast, entitled This Moment with Swedish rapper Timbuktu, is now out. You can follow him on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Marcus Cooks. So welcome to all of our panelists, and we're really pleased to see you all here today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great. The Nordic countries are often seen as models of equality and social justice. In this first of several virtual panels on issues facing contemporary society, our 4 distinguished panelists will discuss the ways in which Nordic countries are approaching concerns related to race, diversity, and inequality. To start, I'd like to focus the discussion on what race and diversity mean, especially in the Nordic context, because the regions, because of the region's relative homogeneity, or relatively homogeneous racial composition. Given this homogeneity, what would you say race and diversity mean in the Nordic context? Marcus?
Sure. That's I love that you put the chef out first. I love that. That's thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. I appreciate that. Jason is the only person I can.
It was the quiet game, man. It was the quiet game. Yeah.
Right.
I found it fascinating the way you teed that question up. First of all, this moment is Jason and mine with both of our podcasts. So we've had fun doing that. It's been incredible, and I've learned so much on not only speaking to Jason, but also speaking to Jason's father, but also through our guests. And I would say, when you said that the Nordic countries are models, you know, I love the Nordic countries, but I have to say that we're on stage one when it comes to dealing with diversity, full and true diversity. It's one way to have a highly layered conversation around caste, class, race, and identity when you have four extremely homogenized countries. So it's easy to say that we're role models. When we are role models, I wonder how many Black people or how many Muslims was asked if we were role models, right? So if it depends, that question, that answer probably changes depending on who you ask there. Because when it comes to equality, we have ways to go. That doesn't mean, Jason and I, we bang a lot on Sweden because we love Sweden. You know, you're not that deeply invested in something that you don't love. So we have high standards for Sweden in terms of equality because we love Sweden and we love Scandinavia. But I do think in terms of racial and social justice, we have a long journey and a long homework to do. And I think we can do the work. We just have to commit to it and do the work.
Could I ask you a question? To do the work, what does that imply? What does that mean?
Where to start?
To do the work means, I think, you know, if you position, I can't speak at all for Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Finland. The only country I can really talk about is Sweden in comparison to the United States, for example, where race in a sense means accessibility, right? Race being a defining which race you belong to. Race indicates class. Race is the barrier to your access to, be it equality, healthcare, employment, housing, you know, human rights, basically. In Sweden, just like you were saying, Marcus, I feel that it's still such a budding revelation, you know. It's like it's still the morning and we've just woken up and realized that the homogeneity that we, you know, had built our identity on is no more, and we're diverse demographics, you know, at least in Sweden. So it's that morning and we're waking up, and so these questions are still so new. I think it's here race is a question of visibility, like acknowledging, you know, an acknowledgement from society in a sense that yes, we are now a multiracial society, a multicultural society, a multi-religious society, from this homogeneity to some kind of heterogeneity, you know, where there's Muslims, there's Christians, there's people from the Horn of Africa, from West Africa, from the Middle East, Central Asia, you know, I think we still haven't updated our identity to the reality on the ground, and the reality has changed. So I think, to me, the work starts there with some form of acknowledgement, you know, that when you look at my face or Jonas's face, you don't automatically assume that, oh, you know, where are you from? Where are you really from? You know, but accepting that looking like Marcus, you, Simon, or me, or Jonas could mean that you're Swedish or Danish or Norwegian or some other, you know. But today we're still on that first square where we still kind of are so, we're still clinging on to that identity of whiteness equals Swedish, you know, or Swedishness. And I think that's a first step of doing the work, is acknowledging.
Simon, do you find that that's true in Denmark as well?
I think it's very true. I think we've been living in a dream of equality, and I think actually it was not just a dream, but some of it was a dream, that we kind of came over the problem of class, for instance. But that's, of course, it's a lie, but it was a beautiful dream. But I think that we haven't realized that we have to change the rules. I come from a Jewish family, and I think that Danes and the Jewish minority it's a success story. It was like the little story about it could actually work. But then the Jews are also kind of a cute minority. It's not a minority. It's a minority. And I think that this self-consciousness about it can actually work with minorities, that was part of the Danish Dream. But I think, of course, it's wrong. And it meant that we didn't actually, as whites, notice what was happening. We didn't see our own racism or our own indifference. And I think that what has happened in Denmark, at least for the last 7 or 8 years, is that we have started to discuss these things. But I think we also kind of, we haven't really reached that, we haven't really gone that far yet. You can see that the literature representation, a thing that interested me a lot as a publisher. We have a strategy that we really want to make a diverse publish. I'm sorry, don't disturb. But we haven't really. We've published so few writers that have a minority identity, sexually or ethnically, and I think it's a great task, and we need to start. But how do we do it? That was why I asked you the question. What do we do? How do we do it? How do we start the work?
What you did, publishing Yaya, you know, Yaya is amazing. And you took, maybe in Denmark, you need to be more known, and you presented that. That's amazing. That's incredible.
Yes, but he also had, maybe some of you also have that feeling that he had the enormous burden of being the only one for years. So he had to represent something all the time and not just being himself. He was a great poet. We really hope that in the years after that, there will be a lot of people who could see how much poetry could do and could see themselves in literature and so on. And I think it's starting now, the last 2 years, maybe 3 years, but it's very slow. But of course we published him, but he's only one, right? We need representation. We need 10, we need 20, we need all the good poets or potentially good writers that are in this little country. If that makes sense.
I'm also speaking from a Swedish perspective, but my feeling when we speak about this issue is that I have the feeling that we are kind of like ahead when it comes to feminism in some sense. Like we have this idea that it's part of our own identity, that feminism is important and equal opportunity and so on. But that hasn't, I agree with Jason and Marcus, that hasn't really trickled down into kind of the idea of who we are as Swedes, that we are a multicultural society. However, I must say, I was born and raised in Stockholm, and like before this talk, I just like sat and thought about a number of things that happened during my childhood. And, you know, the idealist in me also want to say, like, we've come a really long way. Like, there was one episode I just remember sitting when I was a kid, sitting with my family in the living room. It was so rare just to see people on television and newspaper, people of color, that whenever it happened, it was like an excitement. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in Stockholm. And I had this flash of, I don't know if you remember this, Jason and Marcus, because it's a great honor to be here, but also like some of the people who were visible, like Jason and Marcus, were like extremely important to a lot of people, just to see faces that you could recognize yourself in. But I had this memory of, I don't know if you remember, there was a Swedish TV show called Lorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
They had like a famous sketch where it was like an overclass woman. It's like a comedy sketch, and they had like an overclass woman who it was like almost like a sequel. She walked around in different rooms of her house with like a magical spray that said like tar bort all skit, which is in English, removes all dirt. She walks around in the kitchen, sprays it, and all dirt magically disappears. And then she walks into, I don't know, the living room, sprays it, all dirt magically disappears. And then she walks in the street, and all of a sudden she sees a person of color. Like she sees, that's the rare occasion that I remember seeing someone who looked vaguely like me on Swedish television. And this person is having a broom and like sweeping the streets. And then she uses this like magical disappearance potion on him, and then he magically disappears. And you know, of course, this sketch is kind of making fun of the racist tendencies in the 90s, but it's also kind of reflective of this, how people thought of immigrants back then. And I would say today, I'm not the most idealistic person in real life, but I must say that something has shifted. Like there are more and more, like fewer and fewer, more and more people are realizing that so many people who are part of this country will never leave, and we have to update our self-image in some ways. And the interesting consequence of that is that they can't really look for ethnicity the same way they did before. Then they start looking for, you know, trying to define Swedish behavior, whatever that is. And that has become even, you know, used against people who, like me, were born and raised here. They are Swedes, but they are not considered real Swedes because they don't behave as a real Swede does. And what does that real Swedish behavior entail? Well, that's like another rabbit hole we can go down in. But a number of really prominent, famous Swedish people have been kind of questioned about their Swedishness just because they are, you know, it's linked to language. It's definitely, as Simon was talking about, linked to class, is linked to the ability of code switching, being able to speak multiple different languages. And I found that really interesting because the kind of inclusiveness of the national identity is always something that can be moved ahead, if you know what I mean. You know, it's not something stagnant. It's not something that you one day can achieve. It's something that is quite fluid and tricky to get a hold of. And that's why I find myself writing a lot about it, because I find it fascinating.
Wouldn't you say, Jonas, that I so agree with what you're saying, and one of the most visible and well-known Swedes on planet Earth is Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and by a certain segment of the Swedish population, his Swedishness always comes into question, especially if he, you know, misses a goal or acts out in some way that it's not considered Swedish. You know, he's so atypical and such a cultural, pioneer, I guess, because he's showing us new ways to be Swedish, like not singing the national anthem or saying that he's the best, just something as simple as that.
Mm.
But I think also, I mean, just to follow up on Jonas' comments, I think it's interesting. Sometimes you learn from a country that's gone through the worst experience. And Jason and I had a guest on from South Africa on this moment early. And maybe because of South Africa's history in terms of race and caste system and so on, right away when Corona happened, South Africa acknowledged that they have 11 official languages. So they needed to get the information out in 11 different languages. And Sweden really struggled with two segments of the population to get the information out, with the elderly, but also with a lot of immigrants that either had Somali background or Eastern African background. So right there, right, if you think about your country as a multifaceted, as a multi-layered, then it doesn't have to wait 60, 90 days to get this information out. Eventually, Sweden in spring, around April, May, understood this and picked this up, and this was addressed, right? And the other example that I want to bring up is that pop culture is a very important segment for us to see ourselves. I think it was last year or this year, early this year, I was so excited that a Swedish show was picked up by Netflix. And they spoke Swedish through the whole thing. And I was like, this is amazing. It's going to be launched worldwide, and they're going to speak Swedish. In the show, there was only one person out of a 10-part show. There was only one person of color in the show, and he was the drug dealer. Right? I mean, and think about this. How many people had to say yes to do the show, then have to really produce it, and then no one stopped and say, wait a minute, we can't have hundreds of cast and actors in this show, and then all of a sudden one black guy shows up and he speaks perfectly Swedish, but he's going to be the drug dealer in this show. I mean, so when I say, so yeah, the Laurie show, that was in the 90s, and at one point, I guess we have come far because Sweden as a minority to the world can be portrayed in Swedish at Netflix. That is an evolution, but as a person of color, I'm still stuck on square one.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that too, I mean, for example, in hip hop, I've been a part of building up Swedish hip hop culture from it being like this imported, imitated culture from New York City in the late 80s to today being one of the pillars of Swedish and of course global pop culture. In that journey, when hip hop, the first like really crossover kind of, I hesitate even to call it a hip hop group, but one of the first groups that rapped that was really big in the early 90s was a group called Diakité. And that was basically, what they were doing was basically minstrelsy, right? And so almost a form of blackface, imitating in a very kind of ironic way the culture. But since then, Swedish hip hop has become a cultural force in itself. And in Swedish hip hop, there's huge representation. Like I remember one year at the Grammys, like maybe 6 years ago, most of the nominees were Swedish Gambians. Leslie Tay, Sena Bossi, Adam Tensta, Erik Lundin, just, and that's just one group. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, this is amazing, because it really honestly only used to be white guys with guitars. But now, so the shift has happened in music. And I would say that the kind of, if I generalize for a second, the average Nordic inhabitant has no problem with consuming culture that comes from diverse, from different classes, from different cultures, religions. Like the consumption of culture is no problem. Eating food from Turkey, Afghanistan, India, listening to music from Gambia, Nigeria, reading books from Central America to Vietnam to India, Pakistan. But still, that there's still a missing connection. Like we'll consume all these cultures, but connecting to and empathizing and including these cultures and acknowledging that they exist in your workplace, in traffic, so or just in social society and social settings, acknowledging that there are barriers for people depending on class and race and culture and religion. Just acknowledging that we exist still hasn't really happened, even though just as Jonas says, I got to chime in, there's a lot more Black, brown, Muslim, it's just the faces we see in media are a lot more diverse today. Yet and still, this is not reflected in things like Swedish TV shows or, even mid-level bosses at Swedish radio or Swedish television or at many Swedish companies. So yeah, we have come a long way, but I'd still say we're in the opening round. We might be towards the end of the opening round, but it still feels like we're in that opening round.
So are the arts a way of beginning to make more of an integration of different peoples into Nordic life? Or?
Well, I think, if I may, like a Yahya Hassan in Denmark being the only one, I think shaken from his coat, you'll find hopefully within the next 5-10 years, there'll be 3 more or 5 more, poets with immigrant backgrounds or authors with immigrant backgrounds, or 15 or 20, because once somebody breaks through the glass ceiling and shows us the direction, then it increases the chances that someone else will do the same and will follow. So I would say, yeah, the arts will be a part of that evolution and progress.
Can I say something? I think as a publisher, I have to, of course, I'm very interested in that, because I think we have to insist on a dialogue. I think that writing and stories is a very good way of connecting with each other, and the language as well. And we can see, of course, there are more writers with immigrant backgrounds in Denmark. We can see that the language is changing because of that. We just published a young writer from Greenland called Nivia Corneliusen. I think she's also been translated into English, and her language is her Danish is very different from ordinary white Danish. And I think if we partake in this dialogue in the common language, in the storytelling, I think we can show our differences, but also our common ground. And I think, actually, of course, I'm a publisher, but I think that books and literature is maybe the best way to communicate with each other as human beings. Could I ask you something, Jason?
Absolutely.
What language are they rapping in or singing in? Are they singing
in Swedish? In okay. Swedish, but with that comes also the invention of a new form of Swedish, just like you have in the banlieues of Copenhagen and Aarhus. There's the immigrant or the suburb English, the ghetto slang, which incorporates words from Turkish, Arabic, Somali, even like old Swedish or old Danish words into this new language. But yeah, most of it is in Swedish. this is the ingenuity of hip hop as a cultural force, is its kind of franchise potential, that it can land in a new culture and then be translated into something that's applicable there. So Swedish hip hop is very much its own phenomenon, which Danish hip hop also is.
Yeah, it is. And you can see there's so much power in the language and so much invention in the language that I think that it will also walk into literature at some point.
But Jonas, you to me, you walked a Swedish hip hop language into Swedish consciousness with your debut book, which was such a huge bestseller. Everybody read it, and you kind of introduced a lot of Swedish readers to a new Swedish, in a sense.
Yeah, I think that one thing, like when I started out, my first book was published 15 years ago, but one thing that I remember kind of fighting against when it was published was this notion of writing about immigrants, because I was so kind of, it was so important for me to say that actually what I'm doing is like I'm writing about contemporary Sweden, like my characters, even though some of them are born here, some of them are born elsewhere, their experiences form a part of, Swedish identity, so to speak. But now, since we're on this like private Zoom call and no one is listening to us, I can, reveal that, of course, like one thing when I look back on it is like, there is this kind of, I think all of my books and my plays and the short political texts have had some kind of underlying fantasy of dismantling or I guess like trying to question the national identity in some ways, and also question the immigrant identity. What does it mean to be an immigrant? Because I grew up with having a very clear idea of what a real immigrant was, and looking around me, I saw a lot of people who were not born in this country, but none of them fit that stereotype. That was something that I often think about that. I think it was Russell Brand, the comedian, who said that an immigrant is just a person who used to be somewhere else. But in reality, an immigrant is, of course, something actually that is being used as a tool to construct who we are in the country. And it has worked really well. It continues to work really well. We understand who we are through the use of the other, or the immigrant, or the woman, or the one who is not like us. So I think that's kind of been something that I've been trying to write about since the beginning. And it's super political also. The words we choose, there was a really strong backlash when my first book was published also, because a lot of people were just like coming out against it, saying that some of the words that I used were not proper Swedish. And that was a great way to segue into writing the second book, showing them that actually, there is a really kind of one tool to kind of get people's cliched image of language and identity to kind of question them, is to confuse them a little bit. And I think that's what I'm kind of trying to do in the books and the plays. At least that's one strategy that my favorite writers have been using.
It's also, I think that if you look at Scandinavia as a place in the world, we are so quick and amazing to absorb things that come from outside that simplifies our lives and improves our life, whatever that is. Just like Jason said, whether it's music from elsewhere, whether it's technology from Apple or whatever, all of us knows that, okay, we got to get new software. So we evolve. Every time we get that notification, we evolve. If there's new headphones, we evolve to get those, because those are improvement of our life. They're less complicated. But when he talks about the simplest form of who we are as people, we still haven't evolved how to deal with one another, because one skin might be a little bit darker, one language might be a little bit different. Somebody might have been born somewhere else. We don't question if the latest software from Apple should go to Sweden. Of course it should. But we do question if 100 refugees are about to die from West Africa to Spain, if we should save them. Guess what? We can build new Apple headphones already. I'm not sure if we can actually build that new ship with those people that are dying. So as incredible people as we are, for me, it's all code language. It's all garbage. It's all bullshit. If we want to fix this, why do we have to fight for the most basic human right thing that exists, which is treat each other with respect and humanity, be curious in each other's backstories? It's a very simple fix that everyone on this panel and everybody that we know can do tomorrow. But it's the layer of complexity that we're adding, because no one is saying, you know, when it improves us. If someone knocks on your door and says, hey, you're going to get a new music system for free here. It happens to come from San Francisco. Would you mind? No, I'll take that. You know what I mean? So anything that comes to improve our life as humans, we're very porous. We're very flexible to do. Anything that might then be a little bit questioning to caste, class, and culture, that's when we say, well, I'm not sure. So, you know, I feel like we have to do the work. And I said this to Jason before, you know, I love Gothenburg. That's where I grew up. And I think it was about 2 years ago now that, you know, my grandparents were very, you know, they grew up in Skåne, and during the end of Second World War, they took in a Jewish girl that came from Denmark, and it changed our lives. It changed their life, and they adopted her. And I know in the backstory, that's one of the reasons why I got adopted, you know, 30, 40 years later from Ethiopia to Sweden, right? So this Second World War, this Jewish little girl that had nowhere to go came into my grandparents' life, and it was transformative. Yet, 2 years ago, the Swedish Nazis walked down the streets of Gothenburg. So when someone says to me that we made progress, I started to cry, because I wouldn't even know how to explain to my grandparents, so everything that I worked on and fought for, that this was happening in Gothenburg, the city that I adore, that I come from. So I'm questioning constantly if we made progress. The second largest party in Sweden, you know, I never want to say their names because I don't want to give them the platform, but you know, so we have real issues. We're an incredible country, we're incredible things, but yet we have real issues that are coded into other things. So we have a long way to go, and that's what I mean with that.
We have a question from in the chat, which asks, how can the Nordic social culture maintain its essence, but also integrate a more inclusive modern culture that celebrates diversity? Do we have to lose what was in order to become what we want?
I would say, no, we don't have to lose what was. We're building we're adding new layers. We're inventing new ways of how things can be what they are, you know, whereas Swedishness or Danishness or Nordicness, if we can talk about, that's a very wide and kind of generalized things, but I'm sure there are certain common denominators, you know, not talking to strangers, or if you get on a bus and there's a seat, there's somebody sitting in one seat and there's a free seat next to them, you wouldn't sit down next to somebody who is a stranger unless there were no other alternatives. That might be a common denominator for all the Nordic countries. I don't know, but no, I absolutely don't think it's a question of losing something to obtain something else. I think, however, that's one of the narratives that certain political powers or certain political parties and people want to push, the fear of we'll lose everything that we have if you know, more unwanted people, just like you're saying, not Marcus, not, you know, these things that we do want as imported culture, music, headphones, all this cultural input that we gladly accept and embrace, but we don't want to accept and embrace, you know, dangerous people and persons from the Middle East and Central Asia or the Horn of Africa, and we definitely don't want to deal with them living their lives in such weird and non-Swedish ways, because it's threatening, again, like you were saying, Jonas, it's threatening our picture of who we think we are, or how we see ourselves. So no, I think it's a question of seeing it from a whole different vantage point. That is that we're being enriched, and the story of Sweden, the story of the Nordic countries, is there are chapters added to it, but they're not chapters subtracted as we add new ones. It's just the story is widening, right? The horizon is widening, our perspectives and possibilities of who we can be is widening.
Sally, can I just say, like, there isn't a great example of how Sweden has done this through food. Meatballs are still meatballs. We might eat kebab on Tuesday, but we're going to eat herring during midsummer. And we also might eat sushi on Friday. And no one questions, when it comes to the national pride, that meatballs and herring is not what we talk about. So through food, you know, one of the best example of integration is the Swedish pizza menu, right? Which is a unique thing. You don't find that in Napoli, but I take pride when you start looking at the Swedish pizza menu, because it's something collectively we did, and it was an awkward way to get it, but it's ours, right? So there are so many examples in food where we have embraced our Swedishness, but we also embrace others, and we are eating better for it. So there are examples in real life. Musicians are solving it already. You know, they're always ahead of us. And the last ones to always solve it are the politicians. And I hope one day that they're the first. And the reason why they're the last, because they're too homogenous.
We have another question. Actually, what's on the Swedish pizza menu? They have the same topic.
I thought you better explain that one.
Yeah, go.
That's a great example. I never thought of it that way. But so, you know, being an avid pizza eater, if I'm going to, so basically there are pizzas on the Swedish pizza menu that are non-existing anywhere else in the world. And they are kind of, so one pizza that I guess doesn't come from Hawaii is the Hawaii, which is just, you know, pineapples on it. And then there's actually like kebab pizza, which is like pizza with, so you could just like, it's awful, Marcus. I love you, but it's really difficult to eat the kebab pizza. But it's a
loved food though.
It's a loved food, yeah.
It is, yeah. But I agree with you. I can't deal with it. But
I think it's interesting as a metaphor. I think it's, just to touch upon what Marcus was saying, I think that the tricky thing, and I totally agree with that, there are certain areas where things have not at all moved ahead, and all of those areas are linked to power, and I think that's really important to remember. Like, if you're a politician, you have a lot of power. There are a lot of positions where we are more diverse, but that is often in areas where you know, that they could be almost like signaling a change that is really not happening. So in boardrooms, we have a problem. Among politicians, we have a problem. And I think that's, we shouldn't be talking about these issues without talking about the hierarchy of power. Linking back to what Simon said about language, I think one of the most interesting things living and working in Sweden is to see how different, how people are treated differently based on how they talk. And it's not simplistic, you know, it's not a thing of if you go into a store and you speak with an accent, you get treated as a foreigner. The actual accent proves your value or gives you a certain power. So what my father spoke both Arabic and French. So what he would do, like if we entered the store when I was a kid, he would like show me the difference in how he was treated if he entered the store speaking with an Arabic accent, which would give him less power, or if he spoke with a French accent. When you speak Swedish with a French accent, all of a sudden doors are open because you could be a tourist, you could be, you know, with a colonial past, all of a sudden, like, you're someone else, you're a person of the world. With same person, same clothing, same haircuts, entering, speaking with an Arabic accent, he had a harder time both being himself and being treated as the citizen that he was. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, the power aspect of things.
That was really powerful, the way you broke that down. Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, also because it's so obvious, if you have a French accent, you're one of these, you're from a place that's very welcome here, that we consider, that we hold in high regard, you know, whereas the Arab accent is, oh, you're from some place that we hold in very low regard because of these narratives, when it should be the other way around. You know, if one truly was in touch with history.
But Sally, this is also linked. This is just like what Jonas was talking about. This was actually about, it's much more layered, right? So immigrant, refugee, or even another small bucket, the way I am, adopted, right? Those are all different rivers. And then you have second generation immigrants that comes out of that bucket, right? And as an adopted kid, you speak perfect Swedish, but you lost your own mother tongue very often. What is that? That's another ish of this journey. But for example, sometimes we count immigrants from different countries as immigrants, but in reality, Sweden has actually very few immigrants. We have a lot of refugees, but an immigrant is really someone that packed up their stuff and said, hi, I'm moving to Stockholm because I'm going to do this. I see my life career is going to improve here, versus a refugee. So we really never talk about these segments as true as what they are, right? Like actually, Jason's parents are true immigrants that came to Sweden for education, right? But if I'm an engineer for Facebook and I speak English only, I'm not even perceived as an immigrant in Stockholm because I'm working for a white-collar job at Microsoft, Facebook, or Google. An immigrant, if you ask the average Swede, would probably be somebody from Ethiopia, Somalia, or Afghanistan that maybe cleans the hotel room. That person's actually not an immigrant. That person's actually a refugee. And I'm not saying that as a human that makes a difference, but it's very important, you know, to know the difference. Because for example, if I would say to you, are you on Gmail, MSN, or AOL, everyone would understand that Gmail is much more quicker and better. So we have learning technology to segment, technically very, very clear. But when it comes to the human and it links to power, we still bucket people together, and there lies the problem, because humans are much, much more complex than any technology.
And I think so often when we talk about some of these subjects, we lose the complexity in trying to be able to really address the issues. Another question from one of in the chat room: as an American, the Nordic countries are known for their social programs. To what extent have these programs helped inclusion for immigrants or refugees? And what are the experiences in schools, for example?
I'm sorry, was that question specifically about Sweden or in Nordic countries generally, or?
Generally, but you know, you can answer specifically about Sweden.
Yeah, well, I think they've been really crucial in Sweden. Not to say that we don't have problems. You know, there's one of the main challenges we have is that the country is like really, the poor areas are really poor and the rich areas are really rich, and there's a big difference in life expectancy between those areas. But I'm like a big fan of a social state that helps out people in need. It would be lovely to be able to say that a big social state is compatible with open borders. I'm not sure I can say that comfortably. I'm not really sure how to solve that issue, because that's a tricky one. Like, is it possible to have a strong welfare state and open borders? I haven't really seen an example of that yet. So I think that's another challenge that will come.
Maybe that's one part of the problem, but I think it's also very interesting to see we have very big social programs in Scandinavia, but does it actually help on social mobility? And it did in the 60s, but it's like maybe it has stopped. So we can have a lot of social programs, we can have a lot of blah, 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 but does it actually, does it change people's lives? And I think that's a big question. I think maybe the other question, can you combine a social state with free immigration? I think it's very difficult, but I think, can the welfare state in itself actually solve its own problems? And I'm not sure about that. But I don't have an alternative to that, because the welfare state, as I see it, is of course concern for the other in some kind of abstract way. But does it work? Good question. I think we have, but it needs to work. We don't have a better model. I haven't seen it anywhere in the world. But housing doesn't work. You can get people an apartment, but it doesn't give them a better life. You can give them all kinds of insurances. It doesn't give them a better life. What does actually give them a better life? And I think one of the things that we have to discuss is our politics of culture. How do we participate in each other's lives? And I think that's a good question. Also for the power. I think I don't know if that's the same thing in Sweden, but it is like we discuss economics, but when we discuss culture, it's different cultures, which is a problem. We don't really discuss what can we do actively to make a cultural politic or politics that works, so that we get, for instance, some kind of common dialogue. Does that make sense for you?
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have to add a discussion of who we are, identity, arts, and so on, to make this social welfare state actually work. And I think one of these things could be something about participation. Be interested in each other's lives, communicate with each other, because I think that the big thing about the welfare state is that we can actually articulate the word we. We think something, we are, but are we actually together in this, or are we living all our different lives, not participating in each other's identities? And I think that would be a bad thing. And I think culture, art, food, books, music, maybe that could solve some of our problems. Tell each other stories. Be interested in other people. Maybe that's too sweet for you.
I think I totally agree. And I think one of the foundations that Swedish hip hop, which I represent, stands on is the fact that Swedes like myself could actually afford to sit and write rap songs all day throughout the 90s, have a part-time job that barely made enough for me to pay my rent, but thanks to Swedish social programs, still be able to pay my rent. Never in my wildest dreams be worried about having to starve or be homeless. I think a lot of, that's not maybe true for everyone in this country, but I do think that the kind of the social welfare, the welfare state has allowed for this very kind of comfortable floor that if you fall will catch you, which at least for me has provided some semblance of, you know, helped my courage along as I was struggling to learn to write a better rap song, you know, so that maybe one day a rap song could pay my rent, but I wanted to do it no matter if it could pay my rent or not. So, and today in this global pandemic, and even if the pandemic has been quite lenient in a sense in the Nordic countries, the live music, the possibility for live music or theater or live anything, talks, speeches, is 100% at a standstill, which means the whole ecology of people are now without employment and going into 6 months of this. This again, the access of welfare or the strength of the welfare state is being called into play. Now, of course, the banks and large industry and tech companies also are interested in the welfare state because they also want to be reimbursed for their losses and so forth. But I look specifically at one of my main lines of work, which is standing in front of standing on a stage in front of an audience of real people, crowded together with no social distancing. That is no longer possible today, and on the horizon looks like it may not be possible in the way that it once was for quite some time. So again, those social programs are crucial. And even though they exist, I'm not sure that they're going to save that ecology of people who depend on live arts. I'm sure that live arts will continue after the pandemic, maybe altered or changed or in new iterations, but these social programs now are a lifeline for a lot of people that I work with and know. So today they're more relevant than they have been in a very long time, I think, for a lot of people.
Well, thank you. It's getting to be time to wrap up our discussion, but I want to thank you to all of you for sharing your personal stories and thoughts about issues that are increasingly important to all of us, and that I think, especially during the time of the pandemic, have been on all of our minds. So we appreciate your participating in this discussion today, and we are hoping that this will be the first of several different discussions that we'll have on contemporary issues. The next discussion in this series will be on Wednesday, September 30th, and will focus on policing and police reform. Also coming up is a follow-up lecture on Sweden's response to the coronavirus by Lars Tregard. That will be on Wednesday, September 23rd. So please visit our website at scandinaviahouse.org for all of our virtual programming, and that includes things like exhibition walkthroughs, lectures and literary programs, children's art workshops, and many other things. So again, thank you to Simone, Jonas, Jason, and Marcus. We really appreciate your taking the time to talk with us today. We could have gone on for a really long time. We had lots of other questions, but it was great to talk with you all. And
great talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. An honor to listen to you all.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you all in person someday.
Yeah, that would be great. Nice.
Thank you. Take care. Bye. Bye.